successful prototyping. In addition, we'll talk about unsuccessful prototyping and maybe the old versus new way of prototyping as you can approach it on your own teams as you level up in conversation design. We've heard a lot from people in the community that designers are being asked to be a little bit more full stack designers, right? Understanding the testing as well as the design, as well as the dialogue management. So this is just another tool to add to your tool belt. And hopefully we can help give some pointers that you can take back to the work you're working on in a day-to-day environment as well. So let's hop in. As I said, welcome. My name is Sam Burns. I'm on the marketing team at Voiceflow. You can follow me on Twitter, DM me, ask me any questions there, ask the Burnsy9, or send me an email if you have any questions after the fact, sam.burns@voiceflow.com. Today, I'm also joined by Ava. Ava, nice to have you here.
Thanks, Sam. Hi, my name is Ava Kianzad. I am a customer success manager at Voiceflow. I'm not super active on Twitter, but feel free to email me if you ever have any questions or anything. I'm happy to help. And yeah, I'm excited to be here. I work with our clients at Voiceflow, so I'm excited to share some best practices and share some user stories with you all.
Absolutely. As we go, one of us will have our eyes in the chat at all times. So if you have any questions, pop them in the Q&A or the chat. We can answer them live or at the end. And as Ava said as well, via email after the fact as well. Great. So I think it's always interesting when I try to put these decks together. I want to do it in not like rarely ever do we copy and paste something that we talked about a month ago even, right? Because the best practices, the ways in which we're learning the industry in itself, it's rapidly changing. So it's always good to ask when we're talking about whether that's design, prototype, launch, handoff. We have to ask the question of like, why are we doing this? And I think that helps set the stage a bit, right? So as a designer or anyone on a conversational AI team, we're going to ask, why do we prototype? And one of the first things we always are going to think about in terms of prototyping is getting that early feedback on designs, right? No matter if you're using a full stack tool or you're talking to customers, in a more advanced prototype, you can always use informal prototyping and testing to get early feedback between designers or between people on your team. And then on the other end, it's incredibly important to pressure test how a prospective user will engage. We're going to go a lot deeper on this as we go, but we need to understand we can't design in a vacuum. We can't build in a vacuum just how we would consume or how we would interact with an assistant, right? We need to understand how our users, how the personas of our users are actually going to engage with an assistant. Better yet, through that pressure testing, we're actually going to be able to build context around an experience. Long gone are the days of being able to just have a rote, think about, a DTMF IVR experience that just press 1, press 2, press 3. We're going to give you the same answer for whoever pushes go down that path. And then we're going to either hand off or give you, one rote variable answer. No, that we need incredible context around each individual experience to have a fantastic and memorable customer experience these days. So prototyping is our way to do that pre-launch, pre-production, so that we know the context is completely built before we go to production. Better yet, if we're only looking at static scripts or flowcharts, we don't really understand how this experience is going to be when we blend modes, right? Whether that is just copy, whether the images come in different sizes, in different different hardware, whether that's a phone, desktop, an Alexa hardware device, for example. We need to blend all these modes together to get an understanding of when does this chat bubble come in? Is the image coming above, below, next to it? We need to have that one-to-one understanding, so we're not just seeing it for the first time in production and saying, wait a second, that's not how that was supposed to look, right? Because if we don't prototype, that's the best thing we can do. And then obviously as NLP and NLU through dialogue management, we're looking at the intents, the entities, the utterances that are going to make up this human-like conversation between an AI and a user. We need to make sure that we can make those improvements to the NLP NLU on an ongoing feedback loop before production, so that we know that the conversation is contextual, built out, and rounded out before we go to production. And lastly, what we've heard actually from some customers, and Ava can definitely attest to this, is a lot of times if you're not doing prototyping as a designer, you're actually losing incredible visibility to your experience that you've designed, right? Because if you go through, even if you design the most fantastic experience, let's say you're doing it in a voice flow, for example, or even if you're just doing it, in a first round script back and forth, you could create the best experience ever. But if you don't prototype and test and create that seat at the table for yourself, and you just hand off, you're never going to be able to have a say or understanding of how that experience looks, feels, interacts with a customer or a user. And therefore, you actually have less visibility and a smaller seat at the table when it comes to your conversational AI workflow. So probably the most text-heavy slide I'll have today. I promise it's much more visual from here, but we have to set the context of why do we prototype? Here are the main reasons. So I promised more visuals. I wanted to create a little bit of an analogy here that I have to give credit to CEO Braden Ream. Many of you might know him from social or meeting in person, but I was talking to him last week, and he actually had a really good example of and when I asked him, why do we prototype, right? And it was more of a design and prototype question, but he likened it to thinking about you approach a mountain range, right? And you're going to go climb a mountain, right? But you see all these different mountains, right? And for the sake of the analogy, maybe one up mountain or opportunity is optimization. One is adding a new channel. One is adding a new mode, right? You're going to add a chat alongside voice, or you're going to go IVR, right? For example, or maybe you wanted to add a new feature within an existing experience, right? All these options exist for your team, or as a designer or a project owner, for example. But there's a bunch of cloud, there's a bunch of fog, so you don't know how tall these mountains are. And if you go straight to development or straight from a static design to development, you actually are going down a path, expending so many resources, designing and building and actually launching for one of these paths without actually knowing how tall, how many resources, how many hours it's going to take. So through the design and prototype stages, you actually are able to move those clouds away, move the fog away to understand, okay, actually to add a whole nother mode, to add an IVR to our Alexa skill, that's going to take the most hours. And we're going to need to spend the most time in our NLU NLP engine to actually, make this experience smarter and more contextual to a user's voice. And actually, we don't have that time. We need to instead spend our time on adding a new channel and a new feature. And that's going to have the most impact on the end experience, right? So instead of just being, dev only, right? As a designer, it's on you and your team to really build out a design and prototype engine so you can tell the story ahead of time through quick, iterative, rapid testing, which experience, which project is going to be the easiest or the most rewarding climb. They're all climbs. They're all going to take effort, dollars, time spent. But you need to be able to have a seat at the table to say which climb is going to be the most impactful to our team and our business. So now that we hopefully understand through those few slides why we need to prototype, let's look at the common types of testing, right? And some of these probably you've heard of, maybe you're running them on a day-to-day basis, right? One of my favorite, buzzy ones is Wizard of Oz testing, which is actually a little bit, it's very original in the industry, but some people will still do it today, right? This style of like man behind the curtain, right? Where you're letting someone work through a design, whether that's on paper, on a flow chart, in a shareable high fidelity prototype, you're kind of seeing from afar how someone interacts with your design. This can happen, very informally with, coworker to coworker. This could be asking your partner, asking your neighbor, right? Very informal kind of script-based testing, kind of see how someone approaches a design that you've created, right? There's A/B testing, which is obviously incredibly important to work with and understanding. Okay, so if someone goes down this path, is this copy more compelling? What gets them to the purchase point quicker? What leaves someone, after my experience, more happy, right? You need to be able to test different copy, images, pathing to make sure your users are constantly challenged. You're challenging yourself to make sure your users are constantly engaged and happy with the experience you're putting out. Remote usability testing, obviously through the pandemic, research teams are starting to really use sites like usertesting.com, for example, and quick shareable prototypes to share a high fidelity prototype quickly with a user base that then you can see how they use that, through a Zoom or a usertesting.com, for example, and really monitor how an experience is interacted. And this can happen in the design and prototype, or even in production. Moderated, unmoderated, obviously, kind of an expansion of that Wizard of Oz style of testing, where you're either letting someone completely run with the design and you're not there, right, through an unmoderated, or moderated, where you're actually seeing kind of that focus group style behind the mirror, how someone is actually not as much behind the mirror, but in the room, understanding, asking those questions, really digging deeper about how an experience helped someone or hurt someone in terms of interacting with your brand or your service. Great. So we know that those styles of testing exist, and I'm not going to make the argument today, and Ava will not either. But we're not going to make the argument that you need to completely scrap the old way, or any of those methods are out the door. It's just an evolution in the way in which successful prototyping, that definition, is becoming, the goalposts are becoming, they're going farther away, right? We need to work harder to reach a certain level of successful prototyping because of consumer expectations and the way in which assistants are being asked to serve users and customers today, right? So let's look at the old way. We could do something very script-based, dialogue-based, where you're starting and getting an initial understanding of an experience with a coworker, with a friend, with a stakeholder, with a leader, and saying, okay, does this make sense? Right? We're going back and forth. I read assistant, you read user, and see A, B, right? You get an understanding, right? If that, let's say, passes those initial tests, you're then going to lay it out with logic, with copy, maybe some visuals, a key in like a static flow chart, right? This I believe is like a lucid chart, for example. In this old way, you can see there's SSML put in there, there's logic baked in, there's some copy, there's some dialogue. All of that is then laid out in one massive flow chart that then can be used where you take a stakeholder or even a user through and say, okay, now we say, what kind of insurance is this regarding? And then they pick one of the three options, you take them down a path. It's very rote, you can test one thing at a time. It's not completely scalable, right? It takes a lot of time to do something like that, even if it is just passing this along to a development team, let alone trying to level up a user or a test group on your internal flow charting. And then we go from that to all of a sudden we're in development, in production. Right? There's so much space between steps 2 and 3 in the old way, because as a designer, you didn't really have the tools or the process or the methodology to prove out your design in a high fidelity capacity. You had to just hand off the flow chart, hope that the dev team understood what you were saying, and then the dev team went to production. And then you would have to log on your banking app, right, for your brand and say, oh, I'm going to go open a checking account, and hopefully this looks like how I put it on the flow chart. Even if you, let's say, had a visual tool that maybe added some mobile mock-ups of how that would look, you still didn't have an understanding if it was going to function from a logic, an SSML, a dialogue management perspective in the live production. All right, so I wanted to give a quick clip. I just talked to a fantastic conversational UX designer at Rocket Central, their internal team, whose name is Colin. I think the first 30 seconds are so helpful in understanding some of that kind of old way and using static flowcharting tools and how he approached that. So just take a quick listen here.
Rocket was doing what a lot of companies do for a long time, is trying to figure out how to manage your content. A lot of people, I've noticed, Excel sheets, Word documents, lucid charts, Figma, tools that aren't really necessarily geared towards conversational design and creating like conversation trees and flows. You can create flows and things like that inside of Figma.
Oh, sorry about that. I will skip forward.
Lucid charts, Figma, tools that aren't really necessarily geared towards conversational design and creating like conversation trees and flows. You can create flows and things like that inside of Figma, but if you don't really know what you're doing with Figma or XD or any of those like kind of design tools, you can kind of fake conversation prototyping, but you're not going to be able to like really get into it. Like,
and I think it's a simple quote at the end, but he says you can fake it, but you can't really get into it, right? So what is he saying when he means get into it, right? I think that's what I want to talk about next, right? We look at this same flow, right? We understand you can do that informal internal team design time testing. We know Fortune 100 teams that are still doing very informal design team time, like initial prototype. That's fine. We're not saying you have to abandon that. That's some really good initial traction. But in this middle spot here, what are some of the things that have changed from the old way, right? Well, consumer expectations are through the roof in terms of how an assistant needs to function. And better yet, in order to meet these expectations, you need consumer insights in order to loop back into a conversation, right? You couldn't do any of that. You cannot do any of that with a static flowcharting tool. And more than anything, you cannot go from flowchart mockup to production anymore because you're missing out on all those insights and can't meet expectations. To do that, you need one-to-one mockups. You need to blend the photoshopped mobile mockup that your UX team or a designer might make for the mobile app with your conversation design. No longer can those live in 4 different tabs as you go to present to internal stakeholders, because no one can get an understanding of what the design is going to look like. You also need to probably, as you're on many teams and you're leveling up your own careers right now, you need stakeholder approvals, right? From leadership who might not be able to speak your conversation design vocab. You need to be able to quickly show them without SSML, right? They can't look at code and say, oh, like this is a delay or this is a pause in between these words. They don't need to know that. They need to see that and understand it and see if it meets the standards for customer expectations. And lastly, as I mentioned before, there's so many quickly evolving standards with NLU and NLP. In order to meet those customer expectations, we need to be able to rapidly test, add in and subtract intents, add utterances to specific intents in the design and prototyping phase in order to make sure this dev phase, which is going to happen. Obviously, every good production, every good experience has a fantastic dev engine behind it. But before we get to that dev environment, we need to hit all of these new expectations, which means the old way is a little bit impossible in order to do that and rapidly scale on the teams you're working on. Right, so before I throw it over to Ava for a quick how-to in how some teams are doing this, I wanted to quickly run through an example of how you might structure an unmoderated user test. I know many of you might want to take what you're learning here and apply it in your jobs as of today, this week, next week. So let's run through maybe a quick example and some quick tips, right? So the 4 steps we're going to look at here are determining the test objective, writing screener questions, determining the task to test, and finalize the test with a survey. Now, these 4 might not seem revolutionary, but they're so important that you can always go back to and when doing an unmoderated user test specifically, that are going to make your life so much easier, and you're going to find the time spent in synthesis after results come in so much more productive for yourself and the team. So when we determine that test objective, right, we need to define a hypothesis. Right, that might be, are users able to get responses about the product or service information easily? If users are able to make a purchase through your conversational assistant, how many steps should it take? Do users understand the actions they take within your assistant through context, right? You're not going to test all 3 of these things at once because you would need to ask 700 questions and you do 700 prototypes in order to get that response. If you're going to capture the time 10 users, for example, find 1 question, 1 hypothesis that you're going to test. Then when we go to write these screener questions of who's going to be in this sample group, we need to ask open-ended questions to get that true feedback, whether that's screening the group beforehand or screening mid or after in a post survey, right? For example, let's ask a question like, were there too many steps in this conversation for you? Versus how did you feel about after finishing this purchase? A is very directive, right? It's leading the user to an answer you want. You want to prove that this was too cluttered, right? Or you want to see if it wasn't too cluttered. You need to structure the question more like B of how did you feel after finishing this purchase? Let the user tell you how they felt versus you putting the words in their mouth as a designer who's lived and breathed with this project for probably hours and hours and hours. You need to remove yourself and take a step back. And then third step, determine that task to test, right? We need to provide clear instructions to your users as well as the content of the task, right? Today, we'll be looking at the returning user experience, looking to reorder a product using our mobile assistant, right? We know the mode, it's mobile assistant, where the task is to reorder a product. And we even can now, as a user, start to think, well, I am a returning user, and you've already done the work to self-select users in this test group that are returning, right, as a persona, but you need to let them know that you're looking at them as a returning user in this test. And then lastly, one tip we always like to say is finalize the test with a survey, right? Watch it. If you even have the best tools in place to gather, transcript data, intent data, pathing data, that's great. Or even, you're watching a Zoom recording of how someone navigated a visual prototype. That only goes so far, because you're seeing I would almost consider a quantitative approach to how someone went about using your experience. But you need to also get some of those qualitative pieces as well, like with some questions like, overall, would you want to use this assistant again, right? Gauge their interest. What actions would you see this assistant helpful in performing? Beyond, and I love this one, because maybe you're just using this right now for finding store hours and helping someone book an appointment. But maybe there's a whole nother use case, like finding your location that you haven't even thought of, that they're continuing to say, like, hey, I would love to find a location. They might not be able to say that to you in the test, in the actual test. So ask a question after the fact. And then how would you describe this assistant? That gets into more brand persona, right? I'll touch on a Home Depot case study here that we worked with their team, but they're big on making sure that their assistant is the same across every single experience: IVR, in-store, chat, web help, right? All of those channels need to have a similar brand persona. So make sure you start to ask some qualitative questions around how that assistant made them feel, or related back to the brand that they know, maybe in person or brick and mortar, for example. And a bonus point, this is a Voiceflow tip that Ava can also maybe touch on, but we always love to recommend using a repeatable component in a prototype that can direct users to a survey experience in the experience, right? Not sending a type form or a Google form after the fact. After they've finished going through the prototype, you can then say, hey, you finished. Do you want to take a quick three question survey, gather that qualitative data through a capture step, and then you have that all baked together in your transcript. So we'll touch on that in a brief second here. Great. So I'm about 25 after the hour, so I'm going to rip through about 5 minutes of a case study before I throw it over to Ava for some in-tool looks. But as I mentioned, we just talked to Home Depot's IVR team and had some interesting results that I thought maybe might relate or touch on some of the challenges your teams might be facing now when it comes to prototyping, right? So they were going through a la carte user testing in order to understand IVR, how their IVR design was performing, right? They were getting through about 12 user tests a week, right? And this was like unmoderated, some moderated, but they needed to be very hands-on, very consultative. The data wasn't always clean because they didn't have a tool to really capture the user feedback, right? Not only were they missing data points, but in order to deem the call testing actually complete or high quality, they needed better data in order to pass that along to internal stakeholders, internal teams, to prove, hey, we need to make this change because of XYZ, or because we're seeing this data repeatedly. So they knew that they had to make a change, right? So then they said, okay, what if we take 3 groups of 50 users each, and we're going to use high fidelity shareable prototypes, right? So through using a Voiceflow prototype as they designed it, they were able to share that shareable prototype link with over 150 users, and even segment and kind of ABC test it across each 3 groups, right? So now they were able to start actually asking real questions and finding answers that they never had before, right? Is there a specific flow that causes confusion for a majority of users? What percentage of users required a live agent's help? What is the average call time? Are there any missing intents that callers repeatedly asked for, right? These are questions that they could never answer before, that then through actually going through and owning the design and prototype stage, that team now has a larger seat at the table that they can take these findings and say, hey, development team, hey, tech lead stakeholder, look at the data that our users are actually telling us. We need to make these changes, or our IVR is actually ready for launch because of the findings we're seeing in our testing. So they actually were able to unlock answers and ask questions that they didn't even bother asking before. Through that, they actually scaled from 12 user tests to 300 user tests in 1 week and spent 50% less time doing that many tests, right? Which 100% of the time on 12 tests, or 50% of the time on 3 tests. They instead of sending out the individual user tests, they were able to spend their time on actually analyzing and synthesizing user feedback. The time that maybe was spent on designing or doing a Zoom one-to-one session now was spent on synthesizing and designing a better IVR experience. So I just wanted to kind of show that quick understanding, very, very simple, hopefully very digestible, that actually helped a massive team and massive brand that is approaching conversational AI today quickly, rapidly they were owning that design and prototyping. They were understanding which mountain they needed to climb before they asked the development team to go and spend resources climbing that mountain, as I go back to that analogy. So I think I talked very theoretically here, some good examples, some good principles. Now I'm going to throw it over to Ava, and I'll also be jumping in as well, but we're going to hop into Voiceflow and show how maybe a team might do prototyping on a very simple project. As we jump over here, and I let Ava share her screen, please drop any questions in the chat. I'll also be monitoring as we go through. But if anyone has any questions on what I touched on already, I'm very happy to answer those now, or can summarize at the end as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. That was great. I really love that Home Depot case study. It really gave us great insight on how actual teams use the prototyping and how it actually helps them to do faster prototyping. So yeah, I'm happy to you touched on that as well. So yeah, just like Sam mentioned, I'm going to kind of reiterate on some of the points that Sam went over to kind of show you how it really looks like in reality and in our tool Voiceflow. So I have basically created a very simple project here. So I don't have any screener questions or any survey at the end, just because the time doesn't allow for this session. But I just kind of want to show you how the prototyping and works in Voiceflow, and also how easily you can just share a prototype link. So whether you're looking to work with usertesting.com to just drop a link there for users to kind of go through the test, or you're looking to share that link with your team, with the stakeholders to kind of test your design. Anything really can be done through that prototyping and the testing tool we have. So in this project here, there's really a one-step project. This is actually what I grabbed from Conversation Design Institute's website. So training and certification, or consulting. So really 2 simple options. Now I'm going to show you how you can kind of easily grab that prototyping link. So we have this share button here. And once you go on share prototype tab, you can see that you can kind of select what your testers input can be. So whether you want it to be voice or chat, you can, have them only be able to click on buttons or type in their choices. You can add, appearance, branding. I've already added a brand image here. The cool thing is that you can add password protection. We often see that teams are kind of concerned with sharing their designs, or just dropping a link wherever. So password protection is a great way to kind of prevent that from happening, and just the people that you actually want to access that design, be able to access that design. And then, you just copy the link and send it to whomever that you want to kind of test your design. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to drop this link in the chat, and I am going to ask our attendees, so whoever can, just click on that link. And I kind of want you to, again, it's a very simple project. It's just a 1 step. So if you can just give it a try and kind of test that project, this design through that link, that would be great. And then I'm going to show you some really great, stuff after that. I think it will take like 5 to 10 seconds really to go through that. So if you can test it real quick, that would be great.
And as they're doing that, Ava, one thing too that I've, if you can click on the share button one more time, one thing I've seen too is like some privacy concerns for like research teams that are saying, when they go to do user testing, they cannot, like best practice is that the internal researcher shares their screen, where then the other, like the tester, they don't want the tester or an individual to share their screen for privacy concerns. So like one thing that we've seen as a workaround is they open up the prototype on their screen and then through Zoom, for example, let the user take over their mouse. Like, I think that's like a nice workaround if you have that issue too.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. I'm just gonna see if we have, oh, awesome. So let's just hop onto the transcript. So what I wanted to show everyone was that once you get the results, so once you have testers, testing your tool, you do have this transcript tab here that you can kind of like go through all the tests and look at the results. This is a great way of kind of giving you insights on how you want to optimize your project, whether you want to make your NLU more accurate, adding more utterances, adding more accurate utterances to your intents, or if you want to kind of understand like the containment rate, maybe like how often people just like drop and don't continue chatting with your assistant, or like how often they ask really for like a human handover. So like the bot or the assistant is not really giving them answers that they need. So they just like decide to ask for a live agent. So with this specific design, because it was very simple, it doesn't like, give us very, detailed information, but you can really go through all the transcripts and see how everyone has kind of like interacted with your assistant. There are, a bunch of different ways to kind of comment on those, or like kind of share insights with your team as well. So like I can mark these transcripts. I can maybe like tag Sam. I think Sam is not in this workspace, but I can tag like different collaborators that are in like my own workspace to kind of have them like review this. Like if you have like content specialists, you can tag them to kind of like look over the content and make sure that it's accurate. So a lot of great ways to kind of like optimize your design by looking at those transcripts.
Yeah, one thing too of it that maybe you've probably seen this too is like, as we talk about designers having a bigger seat at the table, inviting like a data scientist into Voiceflow to collaborate with you earlier on like the NLU and the intents and utterances, and even add intents back in based on the testing, like that, all of a sudden now you are kind of hosting the party when it comes to conversational AI, which allows you to have like a little bit more say in the end result before production, right? Because you're not going to see all the feedback from a live production research always, especially on larger teams.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great point, Sam. I think so we see really in like a lot of teams that they have like content specialist strategies on the canvas, so you can do live collaboration on Voiceflow, which is great, so they can all like work together on a project. One thing that we have been kind of seeing in bigger teams, I would say, is that sometimes the more senior stakeholders does not really want to get involved in like the details of the design. So they don't want to come on the canvas and kind of like look at the design itself. They just want to see how the user experience looks like. And that's like a great way, for them to just kind of like take that link, test the assistant, and kind of, give their feedback to the designers or, to their team. So yeah, that was a great point. I'm going to pause here. Any questions maybe in the chat?
Yeah, nothing right now, it looks like. But yeah, feel free, anyone, to keep dropping as we go, and we'll have about 5 or 10 minutes at the end to answer questions too, if anyone has any.
Awesome. Cool. And then another thing that Sam went over, and I want to kind of showcase that in Voiceflow as well, is A/B testing, or having different personas. We often see teams want to kind of test their designs with different maybe business personas, different scenarios, and we do have a great feature for that as well that I kind of want to show you how that looks like. So this is the same project that we just tested. I just added one really quick step before going through the flow, and that condition is basically I try to have like two different paths for so the personas that I'm identifying for this project is if I have a new user coming onto my website or wherever my assistant is, or I have a returning user. So I just want to kind of like change my way of welcoming them, maybe just very simple again. And so I have like the new user going through this flow, and then my returning user go through this flow. The only difference here is really like the wording of the welcome message, and how you can actually achieve that in Voiceflow is using the user personas feature. So once you kind of go to your test tool, then you do have options here to create different personas. So you can add new personas using this little menu here. You can name your persona, and then you can decide which block you want this to start from, and then you can add variables to it. So there are a bunch of built-in variables in Voiceflow. I'm not going to go too much into that, but you can add variables to your project as well. For this one, I have used, again, two very simple ones. So for my new user, I have kind of set the sessions to be one. So this is their first session, or the returning user, which the session is two. So this means that this is their second time pulling up this page or like interacting with this assistant. And then on the testing tool itself, you can choose again from the personas that you have created. So which persona do you want your user to kind of go through the test for? So I'm just gonna run a test as a returning user just to show you how that looks like. So as you can see, I just went through the second flow because I set the user persona to the returning user. So it says welcome back, and I'm just gonna again pick one of these items. So again, very simple way of adding different personas, and this is actually a newer feature that we have, and it was really because we had like a lot of requests for it from our bigger teams as well, because they often have like many different scenarios that they want to make sure that they account for. So they design for all those scenarios, and they also want to make sure that they can test with all of those scenarios. So instead of having like a lot of different blocks on your canvas to kind of recreate those personas and like have different flows to kind of test those, you can just have that in one simple flow and use the different user personas to kind of test them out as well.
Yeah, this really cleans up the canvas too, doesn't it? Right, with like I remember we've talked to some teams that used to use like set blocks and like set condition, and then you have like 7, right, to like be able to create a persona. But then when it came time to test, you'd actually have to like set the variable and only share that link. Where now, like the Home Depot example I said, that I think that was like last year, for example, they had to probably create 3 different projects for those 3 groups of 50. Now they could just say, I want to test within that 50. I want to test 5 of this, 10 of this, 15 of this, depending on the user persona that you do want to think about.
Exactly. Yeah, it really helps clean up the canvas for sure. And it just, makes it super easy to navigate the design. And this is the last thing that I kind of want to touch on. And with the sharing, like sharing the prototype, as I mentioned, you do have the option to like select the user persona that you want your user to kind of test. So just wanted to kind of show how that looks like here. So it's, again, easy. You just like select the user persona, copy link, and then send that to your testers. And you can really like you can share the link for like different personas at the same time, and just like save a lot of time for that testing process. So like you have 3, 10, 50 different personas. You can just create a link for each of those personas, share that with your team or from like with other, testers from outside of your organization maybe, and then they can just go through the tests all at the same time. And again, it saves a lot of time for sure.
Yeah. And then when you're ready to hand this project off to the dev team, for example, you already know, you've already worked out all the kinks, right? You understand what logic and what intents need to be added back in. You have a much more like fully fledged, ready to roll project that you're going to be pretty confident of how it's going to appear, save maybe a few UX or simple changes in logic that need to happen in production. But this again gives you as designers like this, I think this is how we would define successful prototyping when it comes to really owning that process now as a designer.
For sure. Yeah, exactly.
I also wanted to mention too, if you don't mind.
Oh, I think your video cut out, Sam.
Hello?
Oh, okay. Yeah, you're back.
Oh, sorry about that. It looks like my internet cut out for a second. I was just going to say, I had kind of talked about very early prototyping, like using a script to go back and forth, right? I think what we're seeing is kind of some teams using Voiceflow as like a sandbox, right? And instead of writing down or using like a Excel spreadsheet or something, they're actually just dropping copy into a canvas, very low production, very low logic, and just kind of creating and being like, hey, let me just rapidly test. If we're talking about successful prototyping, that's early now, right? You can just click play, have a friend come over, look at your screen, or send it to someone and be like, hey, does this make general sense 1%, right? I think it's important to talk about not only the very advanced steps, but also very early as a designer, just kind of rapidly trying script and logic out as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that's basically what I wanted to kind of like showcase. Again, to kind of reiterate on the points that you went over earlier. So for everyone, really feel free to post questions if you have any right now in the chat, or I'm happy to answer, any questions after our chat today via email as well.